Good morning. We're here to talk about a story of trauma, a story of endurance, a story of perseverance, and how that story was shared with the world. This compelling story made for some compelling journalism. And I got to tell you, I can't begin to tell this story nearly as well as the two women who are on my left here. So I'm going to get out of the way and let them tell their story. We'll start with Johanna. Please describe a little bit about what happened to you in 2007, if you'd get us started with that, please.
In 2007, it was started off in February. I was raped at knife point by my ex-boyfriend, and later on March 5th of 2007, I was shot in the face with a sawed-off shotgun.
And at that point, Rachel, what had happened to Johanna was big news in Cleveland. And this is where you came in. Tell us what you were thinking as you started to cover this story.
Sure. So at the time, I covered the juvenile court in Cleveland. And so it was kind of a daily news story. We were trying to figure out what had happened, how did this happen, trying to reach public officials and find out how this young man who should have been in the juvenile detention center was out walking around. He was supposed to be monitored by ankle bracelet and was not following those directions. So, my immediate tasks were to find out how the system had failed Johanna. But at the same time, we were kind of curious as to the interpersonal part of how this situation happened. And my colleague, Gus Chan, and I decided that we wanted to try to reach out to Johanna and talk to her family, which we had tried to do for the original story, but she was still in some pretty precarious position. She'd been rushed to the hospital. She had significant damage, and so she was, we couldn't just kind of go in and try to talk to her, so we went to the local hospital and attempted to talk to her family members who, despite being a very scary situation, traumatic situation, kind of immediately said, maybe this is something she might want to do, but that's got to be her decision, and she's not in the position to make that at this moment. And so we just very simply asked, can we meet Johanna if she's okay with that? And so I think it was probably within that very first week that we were able to go to her hospital room, and at that point she couldn't speak. So we had a little whiteboard that we were writing back and forth on, and we kind of made an introduction, and Gus and I basically just said, we think there's a story here that we want to tell. We're not going to assume what that story is at this very moment, but we'd like to just start kind of following and tagging along with what's going to happen, next, and see where we go. And Johanna had lots of questions. She was furiously writing on her whiteboard, asking us questions about ourselves, really trying to get a feel for who we were and what we wanted to do. And, I at that point was like, why don't you take some time to think about it and let us know? And she was kind of already resolute. She, people needed to know what happened. And she had this feeling from the beginning that she wanted to talk about what happened to her so that other people would know. And an idea that she wanted to have some kind of ownership over her own story, because all kinds of people were already kind of telling it amongst themselves. And I think that one of the very first things that she was talking about with us when she was writing back and forth was that, I want to help people. I don't want this to happen to anybody else. So I think that's where we started. We didn't have an idea of exactly what the story would be, but we knew that it was important to kind of be there kind of on this ground level to see where it went. So that's where we kind of started off.
Was there an aha moment where you realized this was going to be a much bigger story? Or did it just kind of grow on you?
I think as a reporter, there was probably many little aha moments along the way. And at the time, my editor, Stuart Warner, who used to be at the Beacon and then was at the Plain Dealer and now is in Arizona, He's the kind of editor, there's a couple different kinds of editors. One, they already know what the story is before you've even reported anything on it. There's other editors who really want to know exactly where you're at all the time. What's the story, what's the story, what's the story? And Stuart's the kind of editor who, he may know what the story is before you do, but he's going to let it unfold and let you figure it out for yourself. So we just had this kind of ongoing dialogue. We knew the story wasn't about a medical recovery. It wasn't about a court case, but we didn't know exactly what it was going to be. And I think it was along the way, and I didn't really have the language in my mind for it yet, to realize that the story really was about resiliency. It took a little while, and we can talk about it a little more in the series. We kind of revamped it online recently, but it was far into it that we had this moment where I was kind of writing, and Johanna had gone to her prom, and we went with her, which we had to dress nice and not be those creepy adults at prom. And I remember going home, that night and talking to my husband, because it was actually our anniversary, and so I went to prom. But he stayed home, and he was asking me how it went, and there was the big moment, was when Johanna was crowned prom queen. But what was stuck with me that night as this turning point that kind of helped me recognize what the story was about was, she was having a great time dancing, despite being very nervous about how it would go. And they were playing, a slideshow of photos of all the students in her class. And one of the photos had Juan Ruiz, her ex-boyfriend, who had attacked her in the photo. And I watched her turn, and I watched her look at it, and kind of just jolt a little bit. And I was thinking, what's going to happen here? And when she turned and kept dancing, that was when I was telling my husband about it. I was like, oh wait, that's it. That's the important thing. People having this kind of deciding factor in their lives of, can I move forward with life? Can I do this? Or is this going to derail me? And I think for her, it was kind of this defining moment that, I'm not going to let this define my prom, define the rest of my life, and I'm not sure that was going through her brain at the moment, but it was kind of a marker for how she was going to have her recovery from this trauma. So I think at that point, I kind of figured out, okay, kind of know what the story's about now.
Johanna, what was your initial reaction when you had this reporter person, a complete stranger, approach you with this idea of sharing your story with the world?
I have to be honest. At first, my family came into my room, and they were telling me all about Rachel and Gus and what they wanted to do, and I was very hesitant at first. I knew I wanted to, but I didn't want to. I didn't know if I was ready. I didn't feel comfortable with myself, and the way I looked was so important to me, and I was so nervous of how many pictures would be shown or what would be shown, and I don't know if at that time I wasn't sure if I was comfortable with that. But the more and more my family was like, well, it's up to you. All you have, the worst you can say is no. I mean, that's, so I agreed to meet with Rachel and Gus. And the more I got to talk to them, and that day when I was asking all these millions of questions, I just felt this immediate comfort. I think what really helped that day when we talked was how honest Rachel and Gus were, how honest they were with me. They didn't sugarcoat anything. They just went straight to the punch, and they told me what they wanted to do, the idea. And what really helped in the end was when Rachel said, in the end, this is your story. I'm just here to help you tell it. And in the end, after doing all of this work, and if you still decide, in the end, you don't want to go through this, then we won't. And I'm like, man, that is like a really big thing to say. I mean, you put in all this work and still, in the end, give me the decision to make. So from there on, I was like, okay, I want to do this, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to give it 100%. And I think I did, right? I gave it 100% and more.
Yeah, and that I think is, it's like a terrifying thing for a journalist to say, hey, it's your story, it's your choice if you want to tell it, because, you're going to invest a lot of time in something, and you can't say that without meaning it. And I remember from the beginning, Gus and I discussed it, and we even kind of told Johanna, we're going to be in your hospital room, in your house, in your face, with you all the time. And if we ever just become too much for you, just be like, okay, I need a minute, let us know, because we can become overwhelming when we're trying to do our jobs and document everything. And when you're going, Johanna had a surgery, and it was 13 hours long, and I was right there. So that's a lot to have someone that you don't even know watching that happen to you. One of the things that we talked about a lot was that we didn't want us telling the story to make it harder, on her. We wanted it to be something that didn't make her feel like a pressure, like she had to be something or do something. And you were talking about in the beginning about the pictures. That was maybe one of the first tough conversations we had, is that, Gus was like, I want to take pictures, I want to come and this. And she was saying, well, I don't really, she hadn't even really walked into the bathroom and looked in the mirror yet, and he's wanting to photograph her. And I think what I said at the time was, if people don't see what's happening now and what you're going through now and what you look like now, they're going to have no idea how far you've come by the time we run the story. And I think another part of the conversation, which would be a different conversation if we were having it now, was that it was going to be some time until we ran the story. It's not like these days where everything is almost in real time. It was 2007. We worked on the story for months and months and months. So it wasn't like she was going to have to every day kind of confront people watching this as it progressed. There would be time for things to unfold. And we had talked early on about, we're not going to run the story until it's the right time. We need to see where we're going before we do that. And one of the things I think about is if I were to go pitch a story like that to an editor now, they would be really pressuring me to tell the story as it unfolded. And I think that can make a story about a situation that's traumatic a lot harder to tell, because you will be just changing it as it goes along, as everybody else engages with it. So, with this, we were able to show her recovery, her family, but if every random person in Cleveland was weighing in on every moment, it would definitely change the way things that were done, that we did.
Question for both of you. What doubts did you have, and how did you overcome those doubts as you approached this process of telling the story?
Did you have doubts? Honestly, I didn't really have any doubt. I just told Rachel from the beginning, I want this to be real. I want this to be honest. I don't want it to be fake. I don't want lies. I just want it to be real, no matter how it made me look or anyone look. It's my story. I want it to be 100% honest. So there was no doubt. I think the only doubt, and it wasn't me, it was more of my family, with certain parts of the story that they didn't really agree on. So that was pretty much the only real issue we had when it came to writing the story. But Rachel did so good in balancing it and making everyone happy, and still making it real, but making everyone else very happy with the story. But that was pretty much the only thing that I can remember of doubt that happened.
I think there was, a lot of uncomfortable conversations, and it mostly wasn't from Johanna's standpoint. She was very open, and when we would talk about some of her, very teenager-y things, the way she coped with things, when she did things she shouldn't, she was never like, oh, don't put in the story that I did this. She was always like, kids are pretty smart. They're going to know if you just make me seem like an angel, they're going to know that's not the case. And so she was okay with that kind of warts and all. She didn't want to be presented as if she was perfect. She even at 17, 18 realized that was not the case, that we are not all perfect people. And with her family, I think the tougher conversations were surrounding how we would talk about her parents, who were both deceased. And when you have a loved one who has died, even if you know everything about them and you know that there's good and there's bad in every person, having everybody else know that is very difficult. So as we were talking about writing into the backstory for her parents, and how there had been some domestic violence and things that she had witnessed when she was younger that she recognized, and I don't even know how at this point, recognized played into the choices that she made. She felt like that needed to be in the story, but she knew that her family was going to be very upset about that being in the story, because it's hurtful and it's harmful to them to have to think about that. And so we had to have some really hard conversations. And I remember, her aunt being like, "Why do you have to put this in here?" And honestly, it was Johanna who said, "This is what I saw. I was there. I saw it. It needs to be there." And so I'm sure that she endured even more kind of flack from her family about some of that. And even still to this day, that's kind of hard on them. But they were going through it too. I mean, they were going through this trauma. They were processing this trauma. And so whether they wanted to be a part of the process or not, they were. And so we tried to really carefully make sure that everybody understood why we were doing what we were doing and understood it. And, you have to make the choices journalistically to include information in a story. But you don't want to do it to the detriment of people going through, something terrible. So being patient with it and letting it play out as a process, I think, was kind of important.
Both of you.
It came back up again recently. She and I were talking last night that more recently there was a play that was made about the story, and so it just really brought up everything again. And when we started down that road with the playwright Tlaloc Rivas, I don't think either of us realized how it would once again just really bring everything up, and even in a more difficult way. So we had a good discussion last night, and I think this is good to talk about in a setting like this, is that for her, telling the story at the time she was going through it was one thing. But now, in the 8, 9, close to going to be a decade since, every time it's brought up, she's got to go through it all over again. And so that is something that we don't have control over. So we thought, this play, it's going to be wonderful. It was very traumatic. And ever since then, to be very honest, because we're at the ethics workshop or whatever, just coming up here and speaking to everybody today about it again is in some way traumatic. So for her and for anybody else in her family that went through it that has to think about it once again.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was just telling Rachel last night, we were talking about it, and she's like, "So how did it really make you feel?" And then I told her I haven't been the same since. At first, it was so, I was just able to live my life, and right now I've just been, on edge, and the nightmares started coming more frequent, and so it's pretty tough. I like she mentioned, it's been almost 9 years, and it's just amazing of how the story is still brought up, and we're here now because of the story, and it's still not a regret. Is something that I am so happy, and I think is one of the greatest decisions I've ever made in my life to do. But it's definitely something that is hard to cope with in time, just because it continues to come, and the more it triggers.
How did each of you prepare yourselves emotionally to share the story and to tell the story? You talked a little bit about that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I cried a lot. I think it was really emotional, and so I don't know. Probably, 9 years ago, I was a much younger reporter, so I probably didn't prepare myself in the most healthy ways. So we should skip over that part of it. But I remember coming to this media ethics workshop around the time that the story was published, and I felt very battered because we had a conversation about some of the decisions that we made in running the story, and someone, and I don't remember who it is now, so I'm sorry if they're still around or listening or involved, kind of stood up and said that we were very unethical in a choice we had made. And the choice we had made was that before we published the story in the newspaper, we printed out all the pages and we put them on a wall in our newsroom, and we invited Johanna to come in, and we wanted her to look at all of them and see what they would look like. Because, it's one thing to, in your mind as a teenager, say it's okay for someone to tell your story. It's another thing to see your face on the front page of the paper 8 or 9 days in a row. It's very, whoa, it's very heavy. And knowing that several 100,000 people are going to see that every day, and in talking to people preparing for the story, I have some friends that I reached out to, that one is a trauma counselor and stuff like that, and I was like, what can we do to make this not as bad as it's going to be, because I know it's going to be hard. And she's like, you just have to prepare, and be ready for it. And we wanted her to see that. We wanted her to know what the story was going to say. And so as a journalist, and I graduated here from Kent State, and I had all my good discussions, and it was like this very strong, you never let someone read a story before it runs. Never. Like, it was like, you can't do that. You will just be like banned. You'll have like a big journalist like scarlet letter on you. But I get why we have those kind of rules. You don't want people to think they can change your work or whatever. But when someone kind of opens up their entire life to you, and they are so young, and they place so much trust in you, and they're really putting themselves out there, I just felt like it was not a big ethical line to cross to let someone see what everybody else would be seeing about their life. And so we did that. That was how we prepared, and I think it went over okay. I mean, and Johanna did read every word of the story before it ran. We sat down, and I wasn't like, hey, here's a version of the story, edit it. I was like, I want you to know everything that I'm saying. I want you to make sure that I didn't make like a technical error or mistake. And I think she like pointed out one thing. She was like, oh, it was, I think my parents died this many days apart, not this many days. I had counted it one way, she counted it another. And little like things like that we talked about, but she wasn't like, I really think you should take out this entire chapter, or don't say this about me, or, there was a couple times I think she like put it down and like kind of giggled and was like, oh my gosh, that's gonna be embarrassing, or whatever. But, I felt like that was the right thing to do at the time, and I'm sure even today people would question that or say that that's not appropriate, and, we could spar over it if anyone wants to, so.
But
what about you, seeing that?
I totally think that was something that was very helpful. I mean, I was very grateful that Rachel even had me be a big part of this. And yes, she's not lying when she said I received a draft almost every time, and I read it every time. And it just felt great to be a part of it. And I just felt like, yes, this is my story, and it just felt great that she didn't keep me out of it. I was a part of it, and then I remember we made arrangements to go to the Cleveland Plain Dealer to look at everything, and I remember just being so nervous. I'm like, oh my gosh, how is this going to look? And I remember going and looking, everyone saying hi, getting to meet everyone, looking what they're going to do, what they're going to display, and I think the toughest one was about the X-ray one, and probably emotionally it was kind of hard to see, but it was very real, and I was like, okay, no, this is going to be great. This is going to be awesome. People need to see. And
well, and some of that I don't think that you had really seen. Like, no one kind of walked into your room and was like, here is your X-ray, take a look at it. And so, seeing that on the front of a newspaper, but without having seen it first, I think would have been really hard. And we even talked as, we would text as the series was rolling out, and she'd be like, it is so weird to be like going to get your coffee, and from the newspaper box or the counter of the coffee shop, you're staring up at yourself, and people are like, So like knowing what was going to be there, I think was kind of helpful, in terms of just being ready for it, being ready for everybody talking about it, being ready for how people might react inappropriately and say inappropriate things, like having all those conversations ahead of time, I think help a little bit. And especially now, and I know that this is a topic later in the day, that there's so much engagement on news websites and social media, you have got to have those conversations ahead of time with people. It really isn't fair. It's actually wrong and harmful as a journalist to just say, I would like you to be the subject of this story, you've endured this trauma, but when people start taking swipes at you on social media, you just deal with that yourself. That's just not the right thing to do. So preparing someone for how people could react, how they will. And so we had people that reacted that, made pretty typical victim-blaming statements. We also had people that reacted in ways that we never thought they would, and made very heartfelt, positive statements about how the series impacted them. And so now we know that those, both can happen. And anytime I'm asking someone to participate in a story, I give them this kind of speech, like, here are all the things that could happen. I want you to make an informed choice. And I think sometimes as journalists, you just want someone to be in your story so bad, like, and we've seen this really derail stories, that you'll just people will just say anything, like, be in my story, but having that conversation up front, I think, makes it a better story down the road, and having that ongoing conversation will actually prevent some of those things that we as journalists see when stories get derailed and end up looking ugly. So it's a good habit that I've tried to get into in doing these stories.
Another question for both of you. Did either of you set any bounds, guidelines, or ground rules for what you were going to report for yourselves or each other as you went through this?
I don't think there were much, not on my end. I was very open with her. I even shared my journal with her. I always wrote in my journal. I had, while I was in my relationship with Juan, and I basically just handed it over. On my end, there were really no boundaries at all. But again, I wanted it to be real, so I was always very open.
I think that the one thing I can remember you ever saying is like, as long as it's the truth. I just want it to be the truth. It was really important that there wasn't anything that was, we needed to drill down and get everything to be right. Because I think that Johanna had a recognition that this was going to be done, and it was going to be done this one time, and it needed to be right. And so that was really important for me. As a journalist, I wanted to try to be really careful to make sure she understood what my job was and what my role was. It's not like a high school student gets a class where someone sits down and explains to you what a journalist may do if you encounter them. And so I tried to explain to her like what my role was in telling the story, like my kind of rules that I had to deal with. I tried to make sure that I had my notebook with me all the time and my pen, so that people in her situation, in her circle, would realize that, yes, I'm reporting on the things that you say, and I may write them down. And I wasn't always constantly scribbling, but I try to keep that out as a reminder, because I think that if you spend one day with someone and you're interviewing them, they're like, okay, you're the journalist, I'm interviewing you. It's, in some ways, whether we want it to be a performance, we each have a role. But when you're with someone day in and day out for 6 or 8 months, people inevitably let their guards down, both, the journalist and the person who you're reporting on. And so there has to be that constant reminder and conversation that I'm here doing a job, you're here participating in this. When you're in someone's surgery and going to their prom and going to their party, you kind of become like part of the entourage in a way, but you still have to let people know what you're doing. And especially with, there was always like 5 or 10 other teenagers around. And so they needed to know that I was reporting on a story and what I could say or do. And, I would remind them that I was doing that sometimes. So I think that was kind of the important boundary. I'm here to do a job. We would talk, and I think that, very honestly, when I remember one moment where your kind of like journalistic radar goes off, and then, when Johanna was going in to have surgery, her family had to leave, and Gus and I stayed. And he's taking photos, and the doctors are coming in and out, and as calm as Johanna could be under crisis, she was very nervous. And I remember sitting there, and she's about to go into surgery, and at one point she grabbed my hand and kind of squeezed it, and I was like thinking like, oh wait, that's not, and I was like, yeah, really, it's okay. It's like someone who is nervous about the surgery, and gosh, I would want to hold someone's hand too, and just squeeze it, and like, it's gonna be okay. But just from, the training we get as journalists, you have that little kind of alarm bell that was like, oh, I'm not supposed to be happening, right? I'm supposed to be writing about this. And then you go, yeah, I'm human, she's human, we're in a very human situation here, and that's okay. And so I think that, it's good. You want to have those reactions where you're questioning everything you're doing, but then you want to be able to kind of toggle back and get a little bit of perspective on it.
Johanna, can you talk a little bit about the support you got from your family and friends as you went through the process of telling this story, or sharing your story, I should say?
Like I mentioned before, my family, they were supportive in the beginning, very, very supportive in wanting to share my story, because they did want people to know what happened and how the system failed me and all those things. But later on, as they were reading and they knew how real it was going to be, and when my parents came in the picture and how there was violence in my home growing up, they weren't too happy about that. So there's where they kind of backed off a bit, and trouble started coming in that sense. But friends, I mean, I really kept to myself. I didn't really go to school. I wasn't going to school anymore. I was doing my schoolwork at home, but I wasn't really going to school. I mainly stayed in my house. So my friends were always either at the hospital or when I went home, they were always there visiting. But I think with everyone else, in the end, even now, my family still has a very hard time with everything. So they're supportive in a way, and then in other ways, when it comes to certain topics, they're not so very happy about. So and it kind of is challenging because I want to make everyone happy. I don't want, any type of, I didn't want anyone to be upset or angry at me. So it was always very hard to kind of make decisions to try and make everyone happy.
And it feels like one of the things that I kind of recognized in watching it is that it's partially because it's very painful for them too. I mean, they felt very helpless. I remember your grandfather just being distraught, like, why couldn't I protect her? And, so I think that it just brings that up for them as well.
Right.
And so the way that she chose to deal with that is different than the way they chose to deal with it. At one point, they were just like, why can't this be over? Why can't we stop talking about this? And from her perspective, it was like, I can't stop talking about this. This is the life I live every day. They just wanted it to be shut down and go away, because then they wouldn't have to think about it and deal with the pain every day. So, and that's one of the things that I've noticed in a story like Johanna's or other stories. In the very beginning, there's just this like insane rush of people who want to like love you and take care of you and protect you and be part of your life, and that really does kind of decline and deplete over time, and then you're left with a few people who kind of are in it with you for the long haul, who understand it. And you may have people that come to your life later who are wonderful and supportive, but they weren't there, they might not get it. And I think I've seen that in other cases too, where those first couple months are not really what the long haul of dealing with trauma is going to be like. And most of the time, reporters aren't around in those moments down the road. They want to be there in the beginning when things are going on. And so we need to be better at coming back later and checking in on those things and seeing how they turned out, rather than only being focused on it's like the first 30 days and then we kind of lose interest unless there's an anniversary or something like that. So it's something that we can do better at, I think.
Got the same question with a little bit different twist for you, Rachel. You talked a little bit about working with your editor. Talk about the support you received from your peers and the folks in the newsroom as you went about reporting this story.
I think in our newsroom, you always have a core of people that you can talk to and deal with stories. But honestly, I think most of that is focused more around the journalism of it and not the personal part of it. I can't remember, and I was thinking about this, I was working with another reporter on a later set of stories about rape kit testing, and we were talking about how we had both been reporters, close to a decade or more at that point, and had covered, I covered Johanna's story, she had covered stories, we had covered school shootings, we were covering this rape kit thing, we had read 500 rape reports in 2 months or whatever, and I can't think of a single person that ever walked up to us in the newsroom and said, how are you doing? You okay? I mean, I remember coming back from shootings, coming back from whatever, and it was always what's next? What do you have next? What's your next story? What's your, no one was ever how are you? And at one point, doing the rape kit thing, this other reporter, Layla Tassi, and I said something to our editor, we're just so we need some help, and we kind of said it in a meeting, and he kind of laughed and was like, what are you, traumatized or something? And it was this thing where we're kind of yeah, we kind of are, but it wasn't a serious conversation that I felt we could have in a newsroom, are you okay? And so I think you find the colleagues that you can sit down and talk to, and just kind of, it's almost more the dump and vent, but maybe not the constructive way of figuring out how to go with it, how to deal with it going forward. And I don't think it's so much, I think sometimes for me at least, and it's probably different for every person, it's the the heavy responsibility of telling someone's story and not wanting to mess it up and wanting to do it right. And I think that part of it can really weigh on a reporter, because it's just so many competing things. You're dealing with a really serious trauma that you're trying to understand. You're dealing with someone's trust, and then you're dealing with this big responsibility to the public as well, just telling the story the right way. And that can really be a weight. And I think we could probably come up with better ways to deal with that, but since we're journalists and we're just kind of always moving on to the next thing, and the next story, we don't find good ways to do that.
And a little bit of follow-up. Missing from this discussion is Gus, the photographer, and we've been looking at some of his images up here. Can you speak for him at all? Did he go through any doubts, or what did he think as he was going through this?
Well, I definitely don't want to speak for Gus.
Okay,
but,
maybe I said that.
But Gus was great to work with on this project, and I think Johanna could probably talk about it too, but he's very just calm, even keel guy, like you couldn't ruffle him if you wanted to. And he was very good at asking a lot of questions, chatting with Johanna and her family and making them comfortable. And he has like 5 daughters. So if anyone was going to be comfortable photographing a teenage girl and lots of other teenagers, he kind of, I think, told you early on, he was like, there's pretty much nothing I haven't seen or been through. I have like 5 daughters. So I get it, And I think that was making her really comfortable. But he's definitely one of those more kind of in the background, just kind of quietly, taking stock and taking photos of what's there. And so he was a good sounding board for me. We had lots of conversations about what we should be doing, what we were doing, what was important to the story. I mean, he was as much a partner in what ended up in the story as what the photos were, just because having someone that's watching everything you're watching and being able to check in with them. And one of the things that I always am very sensitive about is, and especially because I'm married to a photographer, is I would never say, Gus was my photographer. Gus is a wonderful photographer who was a partner in this project. He doesn't belong to anybody except for himself. And I think in many projects, journalists who do a good job find great partnerships in the people who are doing the visual part of the project, if they're lucky enough to have someone these days that is doing the visual part of it and they're not doing everything on their own. Because someone who is sitting back and observing everything more quietly and looking at a lot of things visually will have observations that you might not have because you're talking and having conversation, and they might see things in a more global way sometimes when you're very focused on specific incidents and conversations and things like that. So,
okay. A question for both of you: what role do you see as mental health professionals should play as a consultant to you as a reporter or as a support for the survivor of this? In this case, or other cases like it. Thank you.
That's interesting. So before Johanna's story, I never consulted a mental health professional in writing a story. I mean, I had interviewed people, but I never consulted somebody. And for this story, I did reach out to someone who was a trauma counselor with Cleveland's Children Who Witness Violence program, and just called and said, how can I not make this worse, but still tell a story? And I think she had given some good advice in the beginning. I mean, she didn't say, here's what you do. She said, you have to let her tell the story in the way that she's comfortable doing it and look for those cues. We talked a lot about interviewing in a way that was not re-traumatizing. And I learned a lot during the story about kind of letting someone have an open dialogue. I think as reporters, sometimes we have this set of questions and things that we want to know for our stories, rather than figuring out what someone is trying to tell us. And so I think it was one of the first stories I ever reported where a lot of the information came from text messages, which was kind of hard. I mean, I didn't know at the time, but we had phones for the newspaper, and wow, that cost them a lot of money because we didn't have an open text messaging plan at the time. But for Johanna as a teenager, that was a pretty normal way of communicating. And so sometimes we would be in person talking about something, and it would be kind of just on the surface. And then later on in the evening, I would get this like big long string of text message from her where she was telling me the rest of it or the backstory or whatever. And I found that she was very comfortable communicating serious things that were more traumatic in her own words, in her own way. So I noticed that she liked writing in a journal. And so I think I brought one to the hospital and I said, hey, if there's something that like I'm asking you and you're not really feeling like talking about it or something that's happening, like if you want to write it down and that's easier for you, that's okay with me, let's do it that way. And I think that worked for us, and I had to kind of change the way I would normally do things to deal with that. And like I think the first time we talked about your parents really, or the first time we talked about your dad dying, you wrote me a really long email telling me everything that had happened, and for you, getting it out like that was better than sitting there and talking about it for the first time. It was a little easier. And then I knew what happened, and I had the context for it, and I could ask some specific questions to clarify. And I think before doing the story as a journalist, I would think, well, that's not the way I want to do things. I want to ask questions. I want to get answers from people. But changing the way I did that, I think, made for a better story in terms of letting her say things the way that she needed to say them, or was comfortable saying them first, and then going from there. And that was kind of at the suggestion of Rosemary Creedon, who is the trauma counselor. And then she also said, it's good to, make sure that there are supports there. And I said, well, it's not my job. I can't make sure she has a counselor or whatever, but I can make sure that people are, I told her if she needed to talk to someone about the fact she was doing the story and stuff like that, she should. And if it became something that, became a detriment to her, like healing or whatever, that she should let us know, so that we could back off or whatever. And so those were some of the conversations we had just early on. What do you think?
I really don't have an answer to the question, only because, honestly, I never really went to go see anyone, so I never really had an opinion. I never went for an opinion professionally with a counselor or anything. I just, let things happen and roll, so.
Yeah. And I think when the story was over and before you went out to start speaking to the high schools and stuff like that, did you talk to someone about how to do that in a safe way with Tim? Or?
Well, yes, I spoke when I worked at the domestic violence center at the time. Really, really good friend, supervisor of mine. We got together and he was telling me about his idea of getting me into to working and speaking into schools and things like that, and healthy way of doing it. And when I ended up agreeing to working there and speaking into schools, that was my way of healing. That was my way of coping and healing and finding peace with myself and what had happened. So that's what really happened. But that's all I really can say.
Okay. Rachel, you already said what you would do to prepare someone to share a story like this. Johanna, what advice would you give to someone who's going to share a story similar to yours?
Wow. What can I really say? I think we all have our own personality, and and we are all different people. We all want to share it in our own different way. For me, what really helped me was just being open and honest, and I tried to be 100% with Rachel in helping. And my main focus was who is going to benefit from this? I just want to be able to help others. I just wanted my story to reach out to someone, and I wanted it to change their lives, whether it was them being in an abusive relationship, or if they were struggling with violence in their home, or those who were not comfortable with themselves. And then also, I was also focused in telling, in people to know that no matter what happens in your life, you can always find a way to move on. There is light, and there's always light in the end of the dark. And that's what was really on my mind, and what really helped me to move forward and to really share openly about my life. And I always told Rachel, and I don't know if and I don't really say this, but I've always been a person that I've always been very honest and very open, but I never really liked attention. And so when this happened,
There's a little bit of attention.
there was just a little bit, and still is, just a little bit of attention in my life. But I think we talked about this early on, that a lot of people, it was just a huge positive feedback about the story. I mean, people reacted. And by reacting, I mean there were thousands of emails, or probably the hundreds of emails. People were contacting me on Facebook or at the time MySpace, and I couldn't go to the mall without people walking up to me, trying to tell me how they felt about the story, or telling me their own experiences about what they were going through, and it probably expected me to help them or give them the answer and what to do. And it was a very, very, very challenging, very hard to deal with. But I just felt so bad at that point, just because I am not a professional. I just shared my story. I don't have every answer. I just wanted to share just because this is something that I felt it was important to tell. But even today, I still have people reaching out to me, wanting to talk to me. So the attention is a little overwhelming. But I think just the focus of helping others is what keeps me going, no matter how hard it can really get.
And I think we were kind of unprepared for that at the time. So social media was not in 2007 or 2008 what it is now. And so when I got a note from Johanna that people were contacting her directly about the story, I kind of like freaked out a little bit. I'm like, wait, and people were sending her messages just telling her their domestic violence situation or what had happened to them, and kind of just like she would get it or like she would fix it. And I remember her saying, she was like at a gas pump one time, like just pumping her gas, and like someone walked up to her, and it was like a young woman who was like, I'm in this relationship, and should I leave or whatever? And she was like, I can't tell you what to do, And we had not prepared for that. So I think that's definitely something I would think about, that when someone reads a story that they can really connect with, they almost like mistake that connection for like, this person is the one to help me. And so if we were to do this or something like this again today, I think we would have to really think about that ahead of time and figure out where to channel that, so we weren't channeling it all to the person who had already given a lot. And I think that happens in other cases, in Cleveland. We've written a lot about the Ariel Castro case, and I know Michelle Knight, and people do that to her. They will send her a message on Facebook as if she is the person that can help them. And she, I can offer some positive words of support, or, tell you that here's where you go get resources, but there is this kind of misperception that only this person will understand what I'm going through. And therefore, I have the right to make them go through it as well. And so that can, I think, be kind of tough too, because I remember you feeling like overwhelmed about what am I supposed to do about all these people who want me to help them, which was kind of unanticipated. So something that we have to deal with.
One final question from me, and then we'll open it up to questions from you folks out here in the audience. It's been, 8 years since this happened? So what have each of you been doing since then? Give us an update on your lives.
I'll go first, I guess.
I've just been doing the same thing, so there you go.
Well, in the past 8 years, there's been a lot of changes. First of all, Rachel and I have become really, really good friends, very, very good friends. We've been in each other's lives when it came to, she attended my wedding. She went to my wedding. I am married now to my husband. His name is Christopher. He's in the Army. So that's why I'm living in Germany right now. So, and what else? I do have a 2.5-year-old son named Malcolm, who I think you saw a few pictures of him just a few minutes ago. I like to speak. I share my story all across the country, so I've been doing that for about 6 years now, very openly, and that's what brought me here to Ohio this time, not just to be here, but I was at near Toledo speaking at high school, sharing my story with them. So it's a little bit of what I do, but that's just a little bit about me now. I'm 26 now. I was 18 then, so I had a lot of growing up to do. And mentally, I have moved on, and I am very happy with my life, and I always like to mention to people that just because a lot of people tend to think that I you know, the girl I was then and I am and the woman I am now, I have not loved myself as much as I love myself today, and I don't think I would have gotten that with everything that had happened in the past, and with Rachel helping me write this story and sharing it. So.
And I know that Johanna probably wouldn't say this, but one of the things that I've just loved about this is that I think sometimes I've written about people I know, and they have this kind of triumphant moment when you write about them, and then they just kind of like fall off the map, and it's not the ending that is happy that people would like to see. And one of the things that I have liked to see about Johanna and what she's doing is that she's actually built resiliency and grown, and like I've watched her as she's gotten older, like set boundaries with people, whereas before she would have let someone tell her what to do, maybe push her around, guilt her into something. She'll say, I'm sorry, this is like the boundary of what I can deal with. And I've watched her do that with her family, and I've watched her do that with people in the public, not feeling like she just has to please everybody, and being happy, like, this is who I'm gonna be, this is what, and I saw that the most, you know, when you decided to get married, and then you had Malcolm, like, when you became a mom, it was, this is the type of mom I'm gonna be. I'm not gonna be the type of mom that I either just only saw growing up or in my neighborhood or whatever, but I'm gonna decide how I'm gonna raise my son and what he's gonna see growing up and what he's gonna learn and have kind of infused in his life. And so I thought that's been just this great growth that you know, you don't always see. And so for me, it's always been kind of, you know, we're friends. It's also been kind of fascinating, though, like to see what resiliency actually looks like as it grows, you know, because I think as journalists, we see these kind of snapshots, but to be able to continue to be involved and be friends. And so, I mean, we both became moms kind of together. We both, you know, and I looked at how I dealt with that stuff, and I looked at how Johanna's dealt with that stuff, and I'm like, man, she's like way ahead of me in some ways. Like I have a lot of learning to do from the way that she's done some of these things. So I think that's been great. And I think, as I said, I'm just still a reporter. So that's what I'm still doing. Has not much changed in all that time. So.
Well, as I said earlier, telling Johanna's story is compelling journalism. I would urge you all to go to cleveland.com/Johanna and read it if you haven't read it already. And now, what questions do you have for these people?
A lot has happened with the plain dealer in the last 8 years or so, especially in terms of like frequency of publication and all that. How amenable would your news editor, your editors, be to doing a story similar to this nowadays?
Do you mean similar? You mean about trauma, or similar in length, or I'm not?
Yeah, well, and I'm thinking about this young boy that was shot and killed last November, Trajan. I mean, one of the things that kind of upsets me, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here, is why there's been so little. I mean, why is this thing 10 months later and nothing has happened in terms of these officers involved, and why hasn't the plain dealer like looked more at this and said, you know, what's wrong with the system here that 10 months later we're not doing anything about this, or at least not covering it or getting answers like we should.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that you know, I don't cover that now, so I can't speak to why, you know, each individual decision is made. And I would definitely say that, you know, the Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com has covered that. Have they done a, you know, 8-part narrative on it? No. I don't know if it would have been possible. And I think one of the things that may have changed is that, you know, when we were covering Johanna's story, there wasn't this insatiable need every second for every detail. People wanted to know, but it wasn't like it is now. And so I think now it's harder for news organizations to let something play out and unfold, because there's this need to constantly be reporting on a big issue. And I think that that's definitely a tough thing to deal with. So if there's this kind of like competition to be reporting on something, how do you take that introspective, long-term look at something? It's something that we all have to deal with. I think there's still a commitment to investigating things, to narratives, to telling stories. I don't think that's gone away, but I think that the way that we choose them has probably changed dramatically.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I do media relations for a hospital, and I feel my role is to kind of protect patients when these stories come about, but also if they want to tell their stories, advise them on what's going to happen. Can you describe the role of the PR department at the hospital and have that played out?
Sure, and Johanna might be able to do that from her perspective as well. But like, so Johanna was at Metro Health, and the staff there was great. And I think they probably feel very much the way you're describing, are very protective. And I think I found that with hospital systems and also other people that work with survivors. But one of the things that I think we have to be careful is there's a difference between protective and then maybe overly paternalistic about someone else's decisions in their life. So the same thing that I'm talking about as a reporter, informing somebody and letting them make informed choices. And I think about this in terms of, I've worked a lot over the years with the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. When I first started working with them, they kind of had this set of rules. It's like, we don't name sexual assault survivors. We don't give their information out. We don't do this. We don't do that, people that we help. And over the years, that has changed to the point where, thanks to Sandra Miller, who's in charge now, she was the media person, basically, when I first started dealing with them. And we had a case where I talked to someone, and I as a reporter, said, we don't name survivors. You'll be anonymous. And the woman kind of looked at me and said, I didn't do anything wrong. Why do I have to be anonymous? And that really got me to thinking about, why should we impose that on people? Shouldn't we be giving people who have been traumatized or victimized back some power to make that decision, rather than basically starting off at the point where, you should be anonymous, which is kind of code for, you should be ashamed. And so I think telling people what all the range of options are important. So as someone who's in a hospital, you have a range of options. I don't want to talk to anybody. I want my privacy. Leave me alone. But also letting them know people will get information about you from the police or from whatever. So you need to know that's going to be out there. I think people knowing what will be out there that's not in their control is important as well. But then here's the range of options. We can help you formulate a statement that you're comfortable with and ask for your privacy and let people know. We can let you know who's wanting to talk to you and what type of stories they're wanting to do. You can talk to someone very briefly, and it can be very managed, and we can, decide what the topics are going to be or whatever. Or you can just have an initial conversation with someone. They might want to do a longer story. So I think that just really finding the best way to roll those out and explain them and let someone make their own decision is good. Professionals, I think, wanting to protect people is great, especially if they've undergone something and they might not be at that spot right then. But someone later on down the line might be like, I really wanted people to know what happened, but other people were telling me I shouldn't, and then I felt like I shouldn't, even though that wasn't what I wanted. So I think that, we can find ways to work around all those things.
When you're there as many hours, it sounds like you had to get buy-in from the doctors and the surgeons and all those stuff.
Everything is a relationship, right? All those people. Dr. Fritz at first, he felt protective like you probably feel protective. This is my patient. I want to make sure they're okay. And so you just have to put in that time and explain to them what you're trying to do and what your role is. And, and be honest too, I've had other cases where, I'm working with someone, whether it be a doctor or someone, and I'm trying to explain to them. And I have to be honest, like, this is not going to be a long-term story. I'm probably only going to have a week to work on this, and that's going to have some limitations. And like being honest on that end of it too, when you're not doing a really long narrative, I think is important too. Like, there are limits to what the story will do. Because I found two things. A lot of survivors that I've worked with are like Johanna. They want their story to be heard so that other people know and understand and can learn from it. And then there's other people who are looking like they just want help. And I think sometimes as journalists, we have to be careful because we will take that route and like kind of let people, like, if you tell your story, people want to help you. And that's why they come to you. And I think that can be a little bit disingenuous, especially when children are lost to violent things. Like I've been at situations and scenes and seen reporters be like, well, we'll put the information out there about your funeral fund. So like, that's why you should talk to us. And it's like, if that is the conduit that they need to get that information out there, yes, that's important because it's a need that they have and it's a job that we can provide. But we have to be careful about trying to eke information out of people under the guise that we can get them a certain kind of help or that it will benefit them in a certain way. Or do you have anything to say about Metro or how they dealt with it? I think they just kind of came in and said, here's your options.
Yes. They were really good at every time, even when I wasn't in the hospital anymore, I got phone calls or an email from them saying, hey, this is going on, this is your options, yes, no, let me know, and what to do. I'll give them your contact and we'll go from there. So They
They
were
even
always
gave her
very
a
good.
fake name. They were so protective.
Yes, Alexis Kennedy.
Yeah. Nobody else knew.
So you can imagine me waking up in the middle of the night, or when my family wasn't around, and a nurse came in. Hi, Alexis, how are you? And I'm like, who is Alexis? I'm not. So that was an experience.
Yeah, and they would sneak her in and out different doors and stuff like that. So it was kind of
Yes.
very, very fun.
Yeah.
Well, this story won the DART Award for excellence in reporting on victims of violence, and that award has evolved. It's really meant to showcase the professionalism, the ethics, and the collaboration of two people in telling a story to others. I think in the context of a conference on ethics, we want to recognize that ethical reporting isn't just avoiding making mistakes. It has a positive aspect to it. And the positives that I heard today were this was going to be a collaboration among a reporter and a subject. And it took some toughness on the part of the reporter to be sure that editors in previous practice didn't constrain some decisions that they made together, that they would wait, and they would tell a story later on in the evolution of what could be predicted in recovery, in portraying resilience, not just portraying horror and terror, and anger at a perpetrator. I think I just wanted to mention that and maybe have the two of you reflect a little bit on what you did that was extraordinary and positive ethics. You see, crime reporters are trained to doubt what is being said and to pierce some kind of a veil that we powerful people have to protect our own images in the face of investigative reporting. But when you're a trauma reporter, you're doing something very different. You're helping to uncover truths that are hidden even from the person who has them, because our brains don't like us to articulate what has happened at moments of being transformed from a human being into the subject of a crime and into something that is degraded in terms of its humanity. So what a challenge to do that and to do it in a collaborative way. I might also point out that these are two women who were telling the story, and journalism once was an entirely male profession. So the truth that's coming out and that a whole nation has to absorb is we're not going to be governed by the atavistic mentality of men.
Thank you, Frank. One thing that kind of made me think of was trying to make sure that the story didn't overtake the story of Johanna. And I remember we were getting towards the end of reporting on the story, and we had written almost the entire series kind of besides the ending because we didn't know how it was going to end. It was leading right up to when she was going to be in court. And Johanna was working on what she was going to do, and she had this moment where she kind of realized when the prosecutors told her that she was going to say something. She had the option to say something, and she was really kind of toiling over what she should say, and I felt like the story was kind of putting an undue pressure on her as to what that ending would be, and I was making me kind of nervous, and Johanna had always expressed herself through poetry. I mean, before I ever met her, she would write poems just to kind of process through what she was thinking or feeling, like some teenagers do. And she probably continues to write, maybe not as much now that she's chasing around a 2.5-year-old. But and so she had been working on this poem, and I went and visited her, and I think we were sitting in your room, you're sitting on the bed, and you were reading to me this poem, and it was very powerful. And I could tell, it was like kind of terrifying whether you were gonna, should I read the poem or not in court? And you think about it, These situations are so overwhelming. You know, everybody knows who you are. Everybody knows about your case. You walk into this courtroom, there's this bank of cameras, all these people, and you're a kid, and you've got this poem, and are you going to read it? And I was worried that if she decided that that was just not going to be okay, that she would like be somehow letting the story down or letting me. And I remember like saying over and over again, because I wanted to end the story with the poem and just leave it in her words. But I remember thinking, like, I just told her, I was like, even if it's been printed in the paper, you can still decide not to read the poem. That is okay. Just because we're saying there's a poem doesn't mean that you have to go through with it and read it. And if you don't, nobody is going to care. It'll be okay, you know? But I kind of felt like we were maybe putting a pressure on you that was unfair. Because we put part of the poem in the paper, not the whole thing. So it kind of ended with the starting of the poem. And so, yeah, you know, poetically, in the best of all worlds, you know, Johanna gets up and reads this poem. And so now I think back on that, and I even wonder now, like, gosh, that probably was unfair, even though we told her she didn't, you know, don't worry if you don't read the poem. But I look back at it, and I'm like, maybe that wasn't the best choice to make. And I don't know, how much pressure did you feel to write the poem, to read the poem?
It wasn't so much pressure. It was just more just really personally telling everyone, and not just him, but everyone, how I really felt. And would it be enough to really express how I was really feeling about what had happened, and I wasn't sure if what I was going to say really affected in how many years he was going to get, or it's just so much on my mind. And yes, at first I was surprised I saw some of the poem in the paper and all, but it was just more of a sense of, I don't know if I was ready to really share that, my true emotions at that moment in front of people the cameras, that I really didn't care to talk to. I mean, Rachel was totally different. It was just more people I didn't really care to have around. And I was really, actually, I was so surprised. And I didn't know there was going to be so many cameras there, to be honest with you. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is the pressure right here. It's like, I don't know if I really want to do this right now, so.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, it was just the kind of dramatic moment that you can't make up. And I mean, I remember sitting there in the courtroom, and the judge is he was a little putting on a show, and, you know, everybody was there, and I was sitting in, like, you know, here's the tables and the judge, and I was sitting on the floor next to the judge's bench so I could see what was going on in the courtroom. I wanted to be able to watch everything unfold. And for me as a journalist, and I still get a little bit of flack about this, and you were kind of sitting in the back with your family, and Johanna's grandmother had gotten up to testify about the impact of this crime, and she testified in Spanish, and it was being translated. And just the tenor of her voice, how upset she was really just sending waves of, you know, emotion over everybody in the courtroom. And you got up and you were very calm about it. But I remember sitting there, and all the TV guys that I work with and so we're sitting there, and I'm sitting there scribbling in my notebook, and I just, tears just streaming down my face, and I was like, oh, I'm never going to lift this down. But it was just, I think for everyone involved in that courtroom, just everything, as soon as you started speaking, just like came out. I mean, there wasn't like a dry eye in there among the people who had been involved in it, because it was just kind of this ending to everything. And of course, we now know it wasn't really an ending. Everything keeps on, but it was just kind of the culmination of all of this emotion. And so it's like you're even thinking, like, how do I even make anybody in the real world who's going to be reading this understand how, like, this moment felt for everybody?
We've gone past our time, but let me ask a question on the other side of the lights. How many of y'all are students out there? One of y'all want to ask a question? Can we get a question from a student?
I know you talked about the support you got from like your friends and family. Did you ever receive any support from your ex's family, or did they ever try to reach out to you?
How can I put this? Of course, his family tried to reach out to me. They wanted to talk to me. They always, and when I did hear a message or when they wrote me on like MySpace or Facebook at the time, they will always say, this is not something that we did. Don't punish us for what he did. But then in the end, they will always bring up like a message that he had for me. So, so that's where I learned to tell them, you know, back off, leave me alone, I don't want to hear from you again. The support wasn't, I mean, as expected, they supported him. You know, you know, that was his mother, that was his sister, they supported him. So I don't know, I really don't know their reaction to the story. I know his mother was in the story briefly, but
I
she
interviewed
was.
her, yeah.
Yeah, Rachel did interview
You know,
her.
we thought it was really important to try to get any of the perspectives we could, and, you know, we talked to his attorneys, and they just at that point would not allow him to be a part of the story. They were doing their job, but we did talk to his mother and try to gather, you know, what she felt about what had happened before, what had happened after, and I do think that she, you know, was very torn. She felt horrifically guilty for what had happened, but she also felt like a mother who needed to somehow protect and support her own son. And so I think there was both of those things going on with her, and she felt probably ill-equipped to do either of those things.
Right.
So, I mean, she could barely even like get off work to go to his court hearings because she was so needing to continue kind of earning an income. So there's a lot of realities there as well. And I've kind of always seen that you've done a good job at setting boundaries, but not having like anger and hate for them, you know, but just saying, to keep me safe and sound, I have to not allow you to come into my life. And so I think that's something that's happened over the years. But it still comes up, you know, people still try to reach out or contact you. We talked last night about how, you know, every time he's moved from one prison to another, they send her a message. And so it's like great because I have a peace of mind knowing that he's still where he is and I'm not in harm. But it's just another reminder, you know? So like each one of those things has a good and a bad to it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And just to add, I received an email the day after my anniversary, wedding anniversary. So that was fun.
So you think everything's fine in your life, and then you just get this email saying, so-and-so is being moved from this prison to another, and they kind of insert themselves into your life all over again.
Thank you both. Thank you all.